Hey everybody, hope that everybody's doing well, and a little bit of a change of scenario here, as you can tell by my different background. Um, it doesn't really matter, but my computer crashed, which was exciting, my desktop computer. So I'm recording this on my laptop, so a little bit of a switch of the game, and finding ways to retrieve the data off my old computer has been an adventure. But anyways, uh, welcome to Module 3, Narrative Horizons. As you noticed in my my announcement from this morning, actually, um, we had two assignments remaining. We had Module 3, which initially was going to be a module based around um, I believe it was called Radical Visions, and it was going to be based around us doing something called kind of speculative rhetoric, which is analyzing the way a field of interest might be improved, might be bettered through technology or through certain advancements or progressions. And one thing I felt was that that was a little too repetitive on the heels of what we did for our AI module, Artificial Futures, in the sense that many of us wrote a analytical critical analysis essay of AI's impact upon a particular field of interest. And that often had a lot of the sense of this kind of speculative rhetoric, if you will, where we're talking about how AI is going to change the game as far as this or that particular field is concerned, whether it's law enforcement or whether it's marketing or whether it's um, therapy, whatever it might be. So I thought it was a little redundant, and I thought we could use a little bit of a switch it up from the AI module. Um, and so we switched to Narrative Horizons, which is again thinking about narratives. Of course, we thought about narratives for our very first module, but in this case, we're not thinking about them in terms of writing them, though the knowledge we gained from that module is going to be really useful here. But in this case, we're doing a rhetorical analysis of a narrative that we choose, which is just to say that we're analyzing a story. Um, now, but we're analyzing a particular story, a non-traditional narrative. And we're going to be talking about, I'm going to talk a little bit about it here, but we're going to be talking about over the next couple weeks, what that means. What does a non-traditional narrative mean? I'll give us a kind of simple definition now, but then as usual, I like it if we can sort of develop our own ideas about what a non-traditional story is. The other thing that I wanted to note at the top here in terms of the shift is we had this third module, and then we also had a fourth module where we're going to do a video essay as a completely separate assignment. As it turns out, our second module took a little bit longer, in terms of establishing kind of a comfortable space or pace, I should say, in terms of us taking on that new work. It took about an extra week. And what that did was kind of shorten the amount of time we have remaining in the semester. So rather than take two assignments, two big assignments, if you will, and sort of squish them into the time we have left, I have instead switched it so that the video essay is an option for this module. If you want to do a video essay based analysis of your selected non-traditional narrative, you can do that. If you want to do a written critical analysis of your selected narrative, you can do that. It's either or rather than both. This will mean a little bit of an adjustment in terms of the percentage breakdown. The video essay, I think originally was going to be worth 10%. So since this module is going to be, well, it's going to be about the same length as our other modules. But it means that we're going to have a few more assignments, a few more discussion boards. So 5% of that video essay is going to go into our participation and activities grade, and the other 5% will go on to this M3 module project, right? The FD3, whether it's a video essay or whether it's a critical analysis essay. So sorry for the red tape at the top here, but I kind of wanted to clarify exactly how we're going to proceed until the end of the semester, because it's coming fast. But not until we have our last module here, which I'm looking forward to, and I hope, well, I'm sure you're looking forward to summer, but I hope you're also looking forward to switching gears out of AI into something new. So without further ado, of course, let me know if you have any questions about any of that or concerns about any of those schedule changes or shifts in the Q&A discussion board, or you can, of course, email me directly, whatever you're most comfortable with. And without further ado, I'm going to get right into an introduction to this Narrative Horizons module, our third module. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm on a different computer, so I'm sure things will go disastrously, but no, it should work fine. Just give me 1 second. Go into slideshow mode. So, of course, as usual, as you're familiar by now, I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of contextual, theoretical, perhaps strange introduction to the module, just to sort of set the kind of theme and sort of where my thinking was, or my thinking is, I should say, around stories. Though it started kind of a long time ago, back almost in 2008. And I picked up the newspaper. I was actually visiting my parents at the time. And I picked up the newspaper. I think I was home for Thanksgiving. It's an article from November 24th, 2008. I picked up the newspaper, and there was a title that the sort of the underworld had been found, right? The Mayan underworld, this portal had been found. And it was a story. Well, I'll read it through part of it. But you can obviously read it here, or pause the video and take a look at the article. I want to read the last paragraph, but the article basically describes how in Mexico, they discovered this network of underground chambers and caves that seem to represent, and they sort of compared it to such ancient mythological texts as the Popol Vuh, and said it was this kind of recreation, if you will, a kind of theater of hell, almost like a haunted house, but built within all these sort of underground caves and chambers. Right. As I say here, it was the legendary journey to the other underworld, recreated in a half dozen caves south of the Yucatan state capital of Merida. And as they say in this article, De Anda was sort of one of the main archaeologists, or the head archaeologist, compared it to these mythological texts like the Popol Vuh to give it context. And this is sort of when they interview De Anda, this is what he says, or this is what the article says, this last paragraph. But why go to the trouble of reproducing hell? Perhaps it was to demonstrate power, quote unquote, De Anda speculates, or to give the living an idea of the terrors they would meet en route to paradise. Clifford Brown, the Florida Atlantic University archaeologist who has worked in the region, agrees that the Maya saw the cenotes. That's the name for the caves, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, and I apologize. The cenotes is a portal to the underworld. Everybody has heard of the cenote of sacrifice at Chichen Itza, but it's less widely recognized that it was part of a generalized cenote worship that existed at many sites. Okay, so what is this all about, other than just a moment of curiosity? Well, in looking at this, part of this article, and so this gives you a sense of what the caves are like and what they found. I don't know if this is the cave or caves. This is just similar versions of it. Of course, they're filled with water now, many of them. They wouldn't have been back then, but they're filled with water at this point. But part of this article was also, they have this chart in there, and I had a real hard time trying to track down a clear version of it that wasn't really small. So I apologize that it's hard to read. It's not crucial that you can see exactly everything on here, but it sort of shows this kind of, the reason I wanted to show this image is I feel like it shows this kind of narrative process where you can see what I'm getting at here, perhaps. Right, that you have this sort of cave and you go through these different rooms and you're sort of going through time. There's a sequence, right? So in the bottom left here, you can see there's a house of worship. There's a house of bats. There's a house of knives. They found remains of coal and an altar found at the very end chamber. There's this sort of masonry wall and small doors. They actually did some construction down into the cave. So they literally created this kind of haunted house. And so this got me thinking about narratives and what narratives can do and what they're like. So this again is a little more information from the article. The underworld is vast with as much variety and landscape as the outside world of the living. Further, there are two great rivers, perhaps more, which run through it. To reach the ninth level of Xibalba, many trials and dangers had to be faced by the dead. These included the crossing of the dangerous waters and high mountains, rivers of blood, attack by spinning obsidian knives and arrows, and even the sacrifice of one's heart. To help the soul survive such an ordeal, the dead were buried or cremated with useful pieces of equipment such as weapons, tools, weaving kits, precious goods like jade, sustaining food such as hot chocolate, and even dogs, real or pottery effigies, to act as companions and guides. So this whole idea of this adventure, if you will, to the underworld, and immediately this struck to mind, like Indiana Jones movies, of course, which are these somewhat problematic if you really look at them. Stories of adventure, but it also brought to mind, in terms of stories for me, things like John Milton's Paradise Lost, or Dante's Inferno from the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. These works of literature that are these kind of treacherous adventures through, well, the underworld, if you will, or different imaginings of the underworld. And it begged a question, of course, why do this, right? We have that question in the article. It says, why go to the trouble of reproducing hell? And there's a number of answers we could give, right? One could be something like it's a rite of passage, right? That it's, it gets us to understand the dangers of life. Or it could be something even just like, I mean, for entertainment. I mean, we obviously use stories, perhaps mostly. I think consciously, we mostly think that they're just for entertainment. But I think as we'll see, that stories do a lot more. They have a social function, they have a psychological function. And I'll try and show that here, that I think I want us to sort of explore and discover here. So entertainment is certainly one. A rite of passage is certainly one. Both is certainly one. And the other thing is just that they also do something about teaching us things like morality or ethics. They teach us something about, I mean, if I'm I'm going to learn pretty quick to fear, X, Y, and, the House of Knives, or, I think they even found like tiger bones or leopard bones in one of the caves. And, so I'm going to learn to fear these things and understand how to be careful. It's going to create bonding with my community, right? If I'm sent down in the caves and I go in and come out and I'm fine, I survive, it's going to create this bonding within the community. So there's all these kind of both social and psychological functions. Now, the way that this really kind of hit home is, as you all know, I have two kids, and so I read stories on the regular every night at bedtime. And I was reading to my son the Lorax, right? And I'm reading this story, and I kind of had this stuff swimming in the back of my mind. I mean, these ideas of stories as these kind of trials, as these kind of these experiments, these virtual reality games that we play, that have both psychological meaning and even social meaning. And so I'm reading the Lorax, right, this children's book, and it's like way back in the days when the grass was still green and the pond was still wet and the clouds were still clean. And I couldn't help but hear these echoes of this sort of apocalyptic story, right? A story where we have, when the grass was still green, right? The world is now brown and dead. The water is dried up. The clouds are now gray or polluted or yellow. It's all smog nowadays. I mean, if you know the story of the Lorax, of course, it really is a kind of adult-based level analysis of capitalism told through a child's sort of story. but it was even got even a little more intense. I'm not sure if this is from the Lorax. I think this is from Oh, the Places You Will Go. Again, another Dr. Seuss story, but it says it's talking about sort of thinking about how your life's going to be, right? So it has this kind of speculative characteristic to it, and then it talks about how things are going to be good, things are going to be great sometimes, but then it also talks about, and I was like, wow, this is getting pretty dark. I haven't read these Dr. Seuss books in ages, if ever. And so there's this line, except when things don't go well, right? Except when they don't, because sometimes they won't. I'm afraid that sometimes you'll play lonely games too, games you can't win because you'll play against you, which is this really kind of, to my mind, mature, um, under emotionally resonant, but also emotionally intelligent, if you will, story about the way in which we can really be our own worst enemies. We play against ourselves. I mean, this is getting into some even mental health issues, you could say. And then the very last page, which I didn't um, scan, but I just typed it out here. All alone. It gets it gets almost brutal. All alone, whether you like it or not, alone will be something you'll be quite a lot. And when you're alone, there's a very good chance you'll meet things that scare you right out of your pants. There are some down the road between hither and yon that scare you so much you won't want to go on. And I'll be honest, I was like, oh my gosh, I was actually almost a little nervous. I mean, I was just reading this book, right? It's bedtime, reading this book, going through it, and it was just kind of like, it made me a little nervous. It took me aback, right? I mean, if I was gonna, one of the stories I would talk about in responding to, well, that was weird, um, would be this. I was like, whoa. And of course, that has a lot to do with the context here. And this is a book I'm reading to my, 4-year-old son. So, but it's taking on, it's almost coming close to taking on this concept of almost suicidal ideation and depression, um, at the same time. So obviously this resonated with me immediately. I mean, we have the Lorax resonating with this kind of hellish landscape, but then we have also this kind of psychological, this emotional landscape that is really kind of hellish and dark, and how at the same time, I'm kind of glad this exists. I mean, this is obviously a personal preference, a personal opinion, but that these lessons are being taught to my son in this way through these stories and these books and these imaginings. Um, I'd rather have him be confronted with things like this in a place like this in Dr. Seuss, rather than seeing it, say, on the evening news, or rather than seeing somebody talking to him, on social media. Not that he's on social media at this age, but you know what I mean. That he's confronting, but he's confronting this tiger within the cave rather than the tiger, out in the wild, if you will. So it really just kind of opened up this idea of what stories are and what stories can do. So to open that up a little bit more, um, um, I did a little research, which I'm going to get to in a second. But this is sort of what precipitated me thinking through developing a module around this idea. So if you took a look at the M3 overview, excuse me, on narrative horizons, this is the basic prompt. If you haven't taken a look at it yet, you'll want to make sure you go take a look at it ASAP, because it will give you even further context, and it obviously will give you this prompt, the prompt that we are going to want to answer, so to speak, with our critical analysis essay or our video essay. So for our third module, M3 Narrative Horizons, we will embark on an investigation into a selected non-traditional story and analyze the message and effect we feel our selected story has upon its audience, as well as the impact of that message. So here you can see those pieces of the central claim statement, right? Impact the message, the impact of that message, and then also make an argument about what we see as the larger significance of that message. So there's that third layer, if you will. What we learn that is of importance from this new storytelling experience about a certain social issue or issues. Now, that's the prompt. And a key variable here, of course, is this idea of non-traditional. So I want to talk a little bit about that just for a quick second, and we're going to go more into detail with the idea of the non-traditional as we go forward. So as you can see in the M3 overview, I'm just going to sort of reiterate what I say there. From a general perspective, there are a couple ways, two ways, just sort of generally speaking, that narratives can be non-traditional. One way is through the medium in which, or the media in which they are told, right? So traditionally, okay, and we're kind of, this is a little hypothetical, but traditionally we're used to narratives happening either in books or in movies and television. Those are the three primary ways in which we intake narratives. Of course, narratives come in all forms and styles. I mean, you could also say somebody telling you a story as well is one of the primary ways. It's the oldest way to tell stories, right, is an oral story. But for our purposes here, I'm saying kind of I think television, movies, or streaming, and books are the primary ways in which we experience narratives. But of course, as you know, we experience narratives in many, many, many other ways other than that. And many of those ways in which that have been around for a long time, but maybe we don't, academia, at least in school, we don't really think about those media too much. So one non-traditional forms of narrative could be things like graphic novels or manga or stand-up comedy or theater or interactive films or video games or board games or web comics or podcasts. So narratives happen in many, many ways. So one way we could think about a narrative being non-traditional is in the way the medium that is used, excuse me, the media or medium that is used to tell that story. Now, second way their narrative, I think, can be considered non-traditional is the kind of story that it tells, right? Which implies that there's something as a kind of traditional narrative framework. Well, this is going to be dependent. So what is a normal story or a traditional story? Well, that's in many ways going to sort of depend on genre, which we'll talk about, right? So, your typical horror film, or your typical horror film is kind of usually a female protagonist because people get more scared about women and children being hurt, being pursued, right? Halloween is like your prototypical. I'm talking the original Halloween. Forgive me, I haven't seen any of like the later Halloweens, but Halloween is kind of like your prototypical normal traditional horror narrative. However, you take something like Jordan Peele's Get Out is a very different non-traditional horror narrative. You don't have a female protagonist or female victim. You have a male victim, quote unquote victim, or quote unquote protagonist, or I should just say protagonist. But more than that, it's a black male protagonist who, and the film itself is taking on, which the horror genre, to my mind, hasn't ever done, taking on issues of race and using the horror genre as a kind of allegory for criticizing and analyzing white privilege, white prejudice, white supremacy, racism, and things like that. So that's a very kind of non-traditional horror narrative. But even things like, I mean, as is well known, Hollywood has done a terrible job, at least in the past, of giving full representation to people not only from a wide variety of cultures beyond American culture or ethnic and racial backgrounds, but also all kinds of gender identities, and so a story can be non-traditional in the way that it focuses on a group or people or that are normally not put in front of the camera or focused in upon. So a non-traditional story can also be non-traditional in terms of its content and the kind of story it tells. So those are things that we'll think about and explore. Like I said, that's a tip of the iceberg. We're going to get more into that as we go forward. And I'm interested, of course, and open to hearing your ideas about how story can be non-traditional. So that should be interesting, and we're going to hear from other people why that's the case. But I want to return back a little bit to the context that we have here. And right, the implication here is that stories do a lot more than entertain. So I did a little research, and there's an article which I'm going to attach or link to in terms of this video workshop by Jeremy Xu. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Jeremy. But this is just a quote from that article, and then I want to take a look at some other things that Jeremy brings up that I think are really interesting. Stories do far more than entertain. Rather, as argued by Jeremy Xu, they help us keep tabs on what is happening in our communities and expose us to points of view and experiences beyond those communities and to perspectives and experiences different from our own. Stories can also be a kind of training ground where we can practice interacting with others and learn the customs and rules of society, a sense of ethics and values. And stories have a unique power to persuade and motivate because they appeal to our emotions and our capacity for empathy. So there's a lot that stories do. We talked about in our very first module that stories in many ways are, they're the primary currency, I think is the way I put it. Sadly, a very capitalist perspective, I suppose, but they're the primary currency, I feel like, of us as human beings. Right? When we meet each other, we tell each other stories about how our day went, how our morning went, how our weekend went. When you meet somebody, you go on a date with somebody for the first time, you're usually spending time telling each other stories about your life and who you are. It's a lot easier to give, or maybe more engaging, and also probably elicits a lot more empathy if you can tell a story about what you like to do for a living, or what you're doing for a living, or how you grew up, rather than just give them a list of facts about how you grew up. So on that level, we can start to really understand that stories have both a social and psychological function that'll be very useful for us when it comes times to analyze our selected non-traditional narrative. So going a little bit deeper into this, this is something that is probably well known. I'm sure I'm not sort of teaching you anything too shocking or in depth here, but doing a little further research, and I'm going to go back to Jeremy Xu's article in just a second, but a classic 1944 study by Fritz Heider and Mary Ann Simmel demonstrates how we are biologically wired for stories. We hear stories or see stories in almost anything. Psychologists showed people an animation of a pair of triangles in a circle. This is a kind of storyboard of that animation on the left, moving around a square, and asked the participants what was happening. And the subjects described the scene as if the shapes had intentions and motivations. For example, the circle is chasing the triangles. Many studies since have confirmed the human predilection to make characters and narratives out of whatever we see in the world around us. But what could be the evolutionary advantage of being so prone to fantasy? This question, that rhetorical question, reminded me. It's like, but why reproduce hell, right? One might have expected natural selection to have weeded out any inclination to engage in imaginary worlds rather than the real one, writes Steven Pinker, but argues that stories are an important tool for learning and for developing relationships in one's social group. So this idea of this virtual place we can do this work in is something that I think is really fascinating and interesting. And I have one of my questions about that, you'll see in a minute, is based around that. So coming back to Jeremy Xu's article, The Secrets of Storytelling, two questions kind of really hung in my brain. One was, why does our brain seem to be wired to enjoy stories? Why do we like them so much? And how do the emotional and cognitive effects of a narrative influence our beliefs? How do they influence us? How do they shape our decisions, our personalities, our visions, or our understanding of others? And Xu's article really addresses these things, and it's really dense. It's not overly dense, but it's pretty rich article for how short it is. So I do highly recommend it, and it can be absolutely useful when it comes to a possible outside source, which we're going to need for our essay. So three things that Xu's article brings up in terms of why our brains seem to be biologically wired to enjoy stories. We are social beings. We communicate, understand, and connect. They tap into this kind of sociality that is in our nature, if you will. Neural coupling and mirroring. We are imitative and empathic. That's how we engage. We learn. We watch one another. That's how we learn about our lives. I see this, I mean, this neural coupling and mirroring is something that I see my son, my daughter doing all the time, for better and for worse, in terms of the way they watch me, and they will just imitate me and do the things that I do, especially those things, right? It's that old cliche, it's not what you say, what you do, or do as I say, not as I do. They're always going to do what you do. And so you got to watch that. Narrative transport and survival, this kind of emotional and communal complexity. Stories allow us to sort of go to other communities or go into other places within our own community, or other um, put ourselves in situations virtually of danger within our communities. This starts to make sense as to why we have so many movies that are about the end of the world, right? Whether it's The Walking Dead or a lot of these superhero films are about, the verge of the end of the world, the saving of the universe, or whatever it might be. It makes sense that that kind of game of as if is something, that high stakes game of as if is something is very appealing to us. They also tap in for reasons. How do they shape and influence us? They engage our empathy, right? When we're reading about some character, it brings up this notion of empathy, our ability to consider the other and understand ourselves. They allow for social cohesion and memory. They give us communal identity and purpose, right? You know the feel. I hear it all the time. I don't see a lot of contemporary films. I just don't have the time. But I remember I didn't see the first Avatar. I know a new Avatar came out. I don't mean Last Airbender. I mean the Avatar. I think it's James Cameron films. And when I didn't see the first Avatar, people were like, "How did you not see it?" I can't, like, they couldn't even talk to me because they were so shocked that I didn't see it. Because it was like the most made at that time, was the biggest grossing film of all time. Most people had seen it. I had not, and I was left out. I was not part of the social cohesion at that point. Receptivity, right? The science shows that we're more likely to be more accepting and open while we're in story mode, while we're suspending our disbelief. Again, another reason why we tell stories. But stories, also, lastly, biology and behavior. Stories wire our biology and behavior. They actually create these synaptic connections, if you will, and ideas. They build these sort of biological ideas within us. So check out the Jeremy Shu's article, The Secrets of Storytelling, because I think it's really useful in terms of further contextualizing the way that stories are so impactful and so meaningful. 5 questions that I kind of want to leave us with, and I'm going to, of course, put those questions down below for discussion, that I think can help us sort of set the theme, if you will, of this third module. Why do stories give us or provide for us? What do stories give us or provide for us as individuals? And think about your own experience. What do you get out of stories? Yes, they're entertaining, but are there other things that you get out of them? Again, I'm thinking back to that, "Oh, the Places You'll Go" story. I don't know that my son will ever remember me reading him that story, most likely not. But is there a way in which those things, he's taking something out of that? I would probably argue, yeah, there is. What do we use stories for ourselves, for our families, for our communities? And again, beyond entertainment, though there's nothing wrong with entertainment, entertainment is important. How and why do stories connect us and engage us? So some of these are kind of similar, overlapping, but what makes them so engaging, right? Why is it that I get hooked into a story? And again, we can think back to the first module and thinking about, how do I hook my reader? How do I get them involved? How do I get them interested in the way that I handle the language, the organization, the diction, the dialogue, the details, all those things, the rhythm, the pacing? What social functions do you think stories provide? And finally, the 5th question, what is the role of the fiction and imagination or unreality in stories, right? And that's one thing that I think is really, there's that Pinker, I think it was Pinker quote earlier about how you would think we would say like, well, we don't need to be watching all these superhero movies because they're fake, they're not real, that's never going to happen. Or The Walking Dead, that's not real, that's never going to happen. But fiction seems to be really important. And at its core, even if you have a story that's based in reality, right? That is a story of a day in the life of some regular person, it's still kind of a work of fiction, right? Because that person isn't necessarily real, or at minimum, that the time in which it was shot is not the same time as you're living in now. But I don't mean to get too weird there. But so just I was curious as to why this kind of fiction and imagination, so you have something like I said, you have something like the Lorax, or you have something like Oh, the Places You'll Go. It's the drawings are wildly unrealistic and imaginative and fantastic. I think it also perhaps has something to do with that openness. But I don't know. I want to hear from you guys and what you think about that. So that's about it. I don't want to keep us any longer. I want to stop the share here. But that's the sort of beginning to our new module, Narrative Horizons. So again, sorry for the switch up in format, but desperate times ask for desperate measures. And anyways, I hope this piques a little bit of interest, and I look forward to the discussion for this workshop, this first video workshop of our last module. All right, take care, everybody.